So we'll walk through the poll results starting with the tier 1 set. And I do invite working group members to ask questions of each other in that kind of exchange, because they're all in the same room together. And that's where you'll get the most traction. So free to ask clarifying questions, try to understand what's behind these comments. We'll take a break a bit past 11 in order to still keep our public comment at 11:15. And I think we'll continue through the poll results and discussion through tier 2, tier 3, and general standards as I've written it, but I know practically speaking, you're going to get as far as you get, and then you'll pick up the rest of it when you meet next week. So let me share on, yeah, William, go ahead. You had a question?
Yeah, I just want to clarify, because obviously some of these topics could lead to lengthy discussions. Are we trying to go through this kind of like a high level and basic questions, or are we looking at having really thorough discussions on each point? You know what I mean?
Well, do you mean by thorough that you reach a point of agreement on something?
Well, maybe not quite that far, but I mean,
okay.
Really, I guess, yeah. I mean, it's hard to quantify. It's more of a sense. Are we going to be coming back to these? Are we planning on coming back to these issues to really get into it, or are we trying to have a pretty meaty conversation? I guess I know maybe that's hard to answer, but is it your hope to try to limit it so that we actually get through it today?
My hope is not to rush. I mean, my hope actually is secondary to where all of you need to go. But my hunch on this is that you won't get through all of these results this time. And to try to do that would probably not be a helpful use of time. So you'll need to get as detailed as you need to get in order to get new information from each other and really start to figure out how you want to use your time together and what that might mean for policy changes or not. So if you only get through tier 1 or some of those questions on tier 1 for now, and you really learn some good things there and you get to ask people some questions or raise some points that are important to you, that's probably, I'm assuming, your best use of time collectively. How meaty that is, I really don't know. You probably know better than I. Whether you reach agreement or not is not actually what I'm looking for today, because you're right, that is kind of a tall order, but hopefully you start getting closer and to narrowing down the changes you'd like to recommend. So with that, let me pull up on my screen just very briefly, because I want you to be able to see each other's faces more than the actual results. Those of you who are live streaming, if you wanted to see a copy of the member opinion survey, it's posted on the website. And I think those of you in the working group probably received an attachment via email, and it's to your website. So there were 16 of you that completed this poll. Thank you for your attention to this. You'll see 17 pop up a couple of places, and here's why. When I first set this live, you couldn't actually skip questions. And so one of you went through and then gave me that feedback. Thank you very much. And so you'll see one person went through a couple of questions twice, but otherwise there's 16 of you who responded. For each batch of, you'll know there were some multiple choice questions that were very qualitative, percentages mostly, or yes, no. And then there was, or quantitative, sorry. And then there were open comment boxes. There's a lot of information there. So for each batch of multiple choice and then a common question that follows it, I have a very brief summary verbally of what shows up in the responses. It won't be comprehensive, nor is it the final word. So my assumption is that that summary brings everybody who are audience members and participant members, depending on how much time you've spent with these results, a snapshot, and it's a landing, a place to start the conversation from there. I am fully expecting and hoping that your conversation then dials down into details you care about and are wondering about, so that you can ask each other those questions while you're in the room. So I'm looking right now at questions. Question 1 was just your name and organization. Questions 2, 3, and 4 is where I'd like to suggest first focus sit. Should the renewable energy standard move to 100% total renewable on an annual basis? Yes, in what year? And then there were a number of comments. Let me just break that down a little bit for you. What I see in the comments, those of you who answered yes to this question, Many already see this as aligned with the goals and realistic to move to 100% total renewable on an annual basis. There was caution about the impact on rates, but also notes that it could be mitigated with flexibility on resource procurement. Several of you were noting time as a mitigating factor as well, and you see that show up in question 3. And that's more time to access new renewables. Those of you who answered no are suggesting moving to more of a 100% clean energy standard to ensure new renewables coming online are actually replacing fossil fuel sources rather than other zero or low carbon emission sources. There's notes that clean has more flexibility to avoid the negative rate impacts. Also comments in there that given the complexity of the electric industry, a simple threshold is operationally unrealistic. Those of you who answered skip this question on either 2 or 3, or maybe on both, in your comments noted that it's difficulty to answer to a timeline. And Shauna from Velco, a quote that embodies some of the skip the question comments: Vermont should move to 100% renewable in the year it starts to strike the balance of clean energy needs, affordability needs, and reliability requirements. You have a copy of those comments in your papers there. I wonder what kinds of questions you have for each other. Senator Brandt, go ahead.
I'm here. So there was a comment. It was a concern about rate impacts. So I am on the in what year would we move? And then it was what informed your answers about when we would move. So and the comment was concern about rate impacts on low-income households, as well as the feasibility of accessing new renewables in a short time frame. So the accessibility in a short time frame, I don't know if whomever contributed that comment could say, is that short time frame now through 2030, for instance? And then I'm interested to hear from the room, but maybe Peter would be most appropriate to address the potential to add those renewables, because it's a sort of a showstopper comment. Like, you could design an RES to do whatever you like, but if it's not technically feasible, then you can't build it. So just wanted to pause on that one, because that to me seems, again, a bit of a showstopper.
And so your question is, I'm trying to understand that comment behind whether it's technically feasible to.
Yeah, it says the feasibility of accessing new renewables in a short time frame.
So,
and it's somebody's concern, and I'd just like to understand it a little better.
Senator Bright, that was mine.
Okay.
As someone who's not as familiar with this world, I've heard a lot of the potential of different resources, such as like offshore wind coming on board, and definitely depending on if we're counting on those resources, when will they be available? If we're doing a lot of new in-state solar, how quickly can those be deployed? So, I think that the sort of resources we target and the dates seem to be, a joint question. So that was my really only comment.
Brian.
If I may, also, just a couple of weeks ago, I sat in on a report that from the industry group, North American Electric Reliability Corporation, in which they did an assessment on nationally what was happening with retirements and then the replacement of those. And basically what they're finding is that the replacements are not coming in as fast as was originally hoped or planned for, and as outlined in the various ISO, RTO interconnection queues. And so that is creating a number of energy assurance issues throughout North America, given the fact that the matching up of the retirements and the displacement of resources going away is not being matched with new resources coming on board. And then even with the new resources coming on board, there are technical constraints that are impacting the delivery of those resources. So there's a dynamic here of, I think, technology-wise, there is an aspect of where timing is not going to fortuitously play to our advantage. But certainly, depending on how you write the standard, there are financial solutions that can get you to a higher percentage. But it's a financial, it's not a operational aspect.
Got one comment online and then Peter. Well, or
Peter was responding.
is this a direct response, Peter? And then we'll take Ken's comment. Go ahead.
I mean, to your comment, Mia, about, whether things are, resources are physically deployed, under the res, the utility can meet its requirement by purchasing renewable energy credits unbundled from an energy source. So even if you have some concern that the physical projects may or may not get built, the utility does seem to be able to work in the marketplace to meet its requirements for new renewable, let's say a new in-region tier one. There does seem to be a shortage of those credits moving forward.
Makes sense, yeah. I guess it's,
Ken and then Christopher.
Yeah, thanks. In the answer that was given, I think people interpreted 100% renewable in different ways. I think, as Peter described, if you are talking 100% renewable with tier one as it sits today, where existing renewables count, then I believe it is doable and can be done affordably. There seems to be some interpretation that 100% includes new renewables, such as the offshore wind. And in that case, you get into Brian's response, where we are seeing those contracts being canceled. When I talk to other New England utilities that are trying to renegotiate those offshore wind contracts, they're saying the price is significantly increased to the point where it's not economic. And they're probably not going to be entering renewal contracts. So you're seeing those projects be delayed. So I think part of the answer to this question about timing and can it be done affordably is really tied to, do you interpret that question to include the kind of tier 1A for new renewables and the timing around getting those resources built?
If I may,
Yeah.
where my mind went was, I think when we go through these questions, it'd be really important for us to agree to, or to understand what the question meant to each of you because of what, Ken, thanks for bringing that up. Right. What does that mean to you? What is the assumption you're making when we say 100% renewable?
Do you want people to try to answer that question now? Or just in comments to speak to it?
I think speaking to it as you're, maybe as you, when you're responding and communicating, say what it meant to you, that would be really helpful.
Christopher.
Thanks. To me, the 100% renewable standard is, how do I want to say this? It should not really be debatable. It's not been controversial from utilities for many years as we've explored this through the legislature, that piece hitting 100. It is, in fact, very much in concert with state law. It is what everybody understands as a foundation to the role of energy in transitioning the economy, right, to a sustainable energy economy depends on 100% renewable. So what would help, what seems to me to be valuable would be to settle on that, which is clearly supported by a majority in the survey, and then move into, well, how do we get there? You know, the breakdowns of the tiers, the how much rate pressure can we handle and accept, what's appropriate, what is the alternative if we don't go there. It's not free to deal with record floods and wildfires and all of those mitigations. So to me, I just want to ground us here in my understanding of state law and basically a non-controversial piece of, once you accept climate change is real and happening and needs to be addressed, it sort of quickly comes back to, well, we need our electric grid to be renewable, 100% renewable, if we mean it. So I hope we can spend more time on detailing and wrestling with how we get there. But to me, I would hope that that's actually a pretty straightforward target. Maybe we argue about the timeline, but it seems like there's a lot of ground that has been tread, including in state law, that's where we're going.
Yeah, go ahead,
Can I
Jeffrey.
respond?
Well, let's take comment first and then.
Sure. So I just wanted to say that in our response, we responded no to the 100% renewables, but not because we don't believe in a clean portfolio. It was basically, we thought that 100% clean was the way to go. That aligns well with the comment on our cover letter that our general manager submitted when we filed for our petition to become a utility, is that we were going to commit to 100% clean in that. We're unique from a load standpoint that for our manufacturing facility, from probably mid-fall to mid-spring, that our load profile at noon looks just like our load profile at midnight because we're 24/7. So we're advocating for to keep existing base load on, because we think that's critical for us to help with our manufacturing. So that was the reason for a no for the 100% renewable, but it is a yes for 100% clean. And then in the context of when should we do it? When should you get to 100% renewables? Well, to the extent that you have 100% clean resources, that wouldn't happen for a while. Should they be decommissioned? Then by default, then fall into the 100% renewable. So that was the logic behind ours.
Sorry, Brett.
Yeah, so I appreciate Pearson's remark. I mean, I wasn't questioning in any way the 100%, which I've, like he and many people have been an advocate for years. It's just wanting to be, check out that remark, that make sure that we're not, that I wasn't missing some sort of technical hurdle that would compromise our ability to get there. My sense from all the remarks is people are aligning and going there. The question is about flexibility and how we actually implement, not if we're going to.
How renewables are defined and timing in specific to this question. Yep. So there's a comment online, and in the room. Let's go to William first and then Rep. Sibilia.
Thanks. Yeah, I kind of agree and disagree with Chris. I do agree that we need to establish sort of a baseline and then try to figure out the best way to get there. But similar to what Jeff was saying, I think we really should. And this question is going to have to be resolved at some point, whether we're talking about a clean portfolio or a renewable. And the way I see it, I think there is general consensus that trying to minimize or eliminate our electric portfolio's impact on climate is a good goal. Given how clean we are already and how clean we're likely to continue to be, I don't know if that goal is worth any price, but I think it's a good goal and I think it should be achievable. But in order to be achievable while minimizing costs and maximizing reliability, you really need to have as much flexibility as possible. You need to have all sort of the tools on the table. And that would speak toward a clean portfolio, and that would be consistent with trying to approach the climate issue if that's really what this is about. The more you can constrain that, in other words, it doesn't have to just be clean, it has to be renewable, or it has to be small renewable or new renewable or in-state, or the more constrained you make it, the more you're going to introduce the risks of increased costs and also potentially reliability issues without making a difference in the climate goals. So I think, the concern about that is the more you do that, then the focus really seems to be less, this is a climate policy, and more, this is a policy that, yes, has positive climate impacts, but it also is benefiting a smaller and smaller group of interests in terms of developers or whatnot, and technologies and whatnot, without regard to whether that makes a difference in terms of meeting the climate goal. In fact, if anything, the more constrained you make it, it's more expensive or more challenging to meet those climate goals as opposed to having greater flexibility. And we fundamentally oppose that kind of approach because we think the focus should be on maximizing the climate impact with reasonable costs and reliability. But if that's not what this is going to be about, if this is going to be a portfolio that is intentionally designed to benefit specific technologies or scales of development or whatnot, then I think we should be open about that, put that on the table and debate the merits of that, as opposed to simply focusing on climate and trying to do climate as affordably and flexibly as possible.
William, thank you. Rep. Sibilia?
Yeah, so I'd just like to kind of reflect on what I saw in this data, which is general consensus that this is something that's agreeable, and for me, if that's what I see, then the next question for me is, okay, where are the finer points that we need to focus on in terms of differentiating, unique challenges, specific investments that are necessary that may not be recoupable, other opportunities that need to be connected here. So, want to with that reflection. I mean, for me, I looked at this and said, oh, look, we have our first almost win. And, point of agreement. And, how can we dig in here and really complete the win? Hear from folks about the finer issues that are necessary if we set this.
So Brian, I'll get to you in just a moment. The finer issues.
Mm-hmm.
I have 3 written down so far, and they're going to seem maybe not as detailed as they need to be. Whether existing renewables count, how many of these renewables include new, right, and clean or renewable. Are those the final details? Would you reword them? Not final, but the finer. Are there other details here that hold up whether you are, talking about this renewable goal still has those ambiguities? Yes, please.
I know we'll get into this discussion later because it was one of the questions, but the piece about the REC pairing and arbitrage is another detail about how this plays out in terms of logistics and costs.
And partly what you're thinking is whether the flexibility is found in how renewables are defined versus how that interacts with the use of RECs and the market.
Yeah, the current structure around the REC market and REC arbitrage is a very important affordability lever that's been purposely built into the RECs. And there was a lot of discussion around that, and also one of the questions, and that is that's a big piece to me of some of the details that's in potential disagreement, and an important piece about what it looks like to achieve that annual target of renewability.
But Rebecca, would you be willing to give more specific details about that for someone who's not in your seat making your decisions every day?
Great.
Help me understand.
Very specific example is we have a contract with Seabrook Nuclear that goes through 2034, and we have made a commitment to be 100% renewable in 2030. And so what that looks like is pairing that nuclear contract with renewable energy credits so that we keep our contract, but we also have the ability to claim renewable through that REC market, right? So buying the ability to call it renewable from someone else. And so that's a current contract, and also considering the fact that that may be a very effective way to balance reliability and renewability, even in a go forward past 2034. That also feels like potentially an important area of flexibility that we might need in order to pair those things together.
I have another question. Yeah. So just sticking with this specific example, and for me, you have to keep the lights on, and people have to be able to pay for it. And we want it to be clean, and we want them to continue to electrify. So I would just ask if if there are other folks who would like to weigh in with information that would be helpful to me, perhaps, related to what Rebecca has just given as an example. Does anyone have other ways of solving Rebecca's worry, or things that they think we should think about with Rebecca's worry as the utility up in one of the poorest parts of the state?
So this is skipping ahead a little bit in the survey, but to the unbundled rec question, which is, I think in this section, as one of the 9 folks who put it depends, see my notes on like next slide, I can say, and I think this similar sentiment is shared by many in this room who were in that group of 9. Generally speaking, the use of unbundled recs, like that's how, and I said this last time, but that's how we account for renewable energy in the United States, full stop. Like that is just how this accounting works in this country, and nobody's, well, I am not proposing, EPIRG would not support trying to demolish that accounting system in Vermont and rebuild it from the ground up with something else. So unbundled recs, as a general rule, totally fine with, not a problem. That's how we do this. The reason I put it depends, see my notes on the next slide, is if we are not having a sufficiently high, and this is a different part of the question, but a sufficiently high level of deployment of new renewables, a sufficiently high requirement for new renewables in the renewable energy standard, then there's a small slice of the renewable energy credits or attributes that we do have concern about in that world. In a world that looks a lot like our current renewable energy standard with a very small new renewable requirement, unbundled recs from large hydro are just not treated the same way in any other renewable energy standard in the region. And we would want to look at that question of, is that appropriate in Vermont? I actually don't think that's a terribly productive conversation. I want to talk about what's the right level of new renewables, and like, can we get to an agreement on that in this room, and just say unbundled recs are fine because that's how we do things. And the sort of pairing, just to be very clear, for anyone sort of who's less familiar with these markets, that kind of pairing that you're talking about, absolutely, that's again how we do this.
I really appreciate that, Ben. That's, I think, a really helpful way to look at it. And I think that's the crux of the problem here, or the crux of the disagreement or conversation is, once Vermont electricity users are using power that's 100% renewable, do we want to then require them to pay for new renewables, necessitating that the power from those older renewables are sold into the market? And once we have reached a place where we're 100% renewable and we are incentivizing and encouraging and helping people go to beneficial electrification, do we at that point want to continue having them pay for new renewables, the power from which effectively goes out of state and lowers others' carbon impact from their electric sector? And I think that's exactly where we need to go, because I think that's exactly the conversation that is at the crux of this. And it can be, we can talk about, as you say, we can talk about unbundled and large hydro and all kinds of other things, but I think that's the crux. There's a lot of ways to get there, whatever our decision is or whatever the General Assembly's ultimate decision. Thanks.
And the question that the two of you are answering is, what's the right level of new renewables in Vermont? Is that, how would you change that question so it's more accurate to what you're talking about?
That, to me, is really that's the crux. That's a central question, at least for BPER in this conversation, is what is the appropriate level of new renewables? We have our thoughts on that. I was specifically speaking to the unbundled recs question, which I think is similar, with the caveat of if new renewables may remain very low, then I think a lot of us will want to talk a lot more about unbundled recs from certain resources. But as a general matter, that feels like one that, just like, are we getting to 100% or not, we can sort of agree that we can set it aside, because pretty much everyone is fine with that, as long as the other answers to the other parts, the other questions like new renewables, are ones that we can all come together on. So I'm hearing a lot of consensus on 100%. That's great. That's very heartening. And I also think unbundled recs is not something we should spend a lot of time talking about unless and until we've sort of gotten to the new renewables question and a lot of us are not satisfied. And I certainly hope we never cross that bridge.
I agree with everything Ben said.
There's a comment online and in the room. So William, and then we'll come back to Brian.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this is another sort of fundamental question. I'm glad it was brought up. So I have a real problem with, and I disagree with the premise that unless you're meeting existing or new load through new renewables, you're not addressing the goals, or you're even making things worse regionally. I think if there's conversion of existing load and if new load is met through clean energy, whether it's renewable or not, that is meeting our goals and that is achieving what we want to achieve. Even if that means you're contracting more power from an existing renewable resource. I think I've heard some of the articulation of the logic as to why that's not the case and why if you don't do new renewables, you're not helping. But from what I've heard so far, it doesn't really seem to make sense to me. And rather than kind of make that argument and then try to knock it down, people try to really explain the logic and engage on that. But I honestly don't see it. And again, I think that is not really a line of argument that is meeting our climate goals. It's a line of argument that's promoting, well, it's just promoting new renewable development for its own sake. And I have a problem with that insofar as that creates unnecessary expenses and other complications. So I think it's worth going into that more. I would make a little caveat though. I do think, I recognize.
William, your audio is breaking up just a tad.
Okay.
Let's try again.
Yeah, so I just want to be clear that I think the rec discussion, I think, is somewhat a different one, and I see that as a more legitimate debate. I don't feel qualified to say something conclusively about that. I think our inclination is to keep things flexible with that, but I think this question of whether if you're not doing new renewable, you're not doing anything. Just to simplify the point, I have a real problem with that.
So my untrained ear hears that the question that you're bringing back to the forefront is the clean versus renewable, and no.
It's, there is that, but within that, the question of whether you have to require or how much you have to require new renewable as opposed to contracting with existing, with existing renewable if that's available, if that seems to be the best choice.
You did lead with what you said.
Okay, so William, thank you. I think there are still some nuances that some of your other ears are picking up on, and I encourage you to ask William or to engage in that. We have a comment still in the room and Chase online. Is this separate? Brian, is this tracking with the conversation that's happening? Or, yeah, go ahead.
Louis made a great point about the fact that the clarity is very helpful because I missed the last meeting, and this is one of the questions that I asked 2 meetings ago is what was the basis for the 100? And with what Rebecca said, very appreciative of the clarification that is being put on the table relative to the unbundled. But let me ask this question, and this may be one of those nuances. For example, if it's going to be based upon an RES on 100% of sales, what happens because every utility plans a certain amount of power from their various sources, as Rebecca has highlighted, and you've laid out that plan. If those energy deliveries that you are planning on from either your renewables or your other resources don't pan out, now I recognize that they could go over production, but if they go under production, okay, how and where do you settle on getting that difference from what you planned on receiving, especially in a net metering environment? Because if the net metering production has gone down, your 100% sales figure goes up. And if you've only planned to cover what was the original 100% sales number, then you've got a situation where you're not going to be 100% covered unless you go out and have to purchase more RECs. who's going to bear the cost of that differential? And then, that's a nuance. I readily admit it's a nuance, but it is a factor of when you start talking about 100% of sales, how the sales number is being calculated. And then, based upon your planning of your resources, how does that all play out to one another?
So whether the RES is based on sales or on some other, I think this showed up in the other comments too, and anyone with more information than I can add here. What the RES is, what the renewables are based on, it was sales, or is this ringing a bell? Am I making stuff up now?
Well, I know, for example, in some parts of the country, there's an effort to reconstitute your true load. So it's taking out whatever was behind the meter or whatever to create the true load of all your customers, regardless of where the supply came from. So that it kind of ignores the contributions that come from the resources that are inside your footprint. And so that you've got the true load as opposed to, a lot of activity where in the grid we operate on a net, which is the load minus what's internally generated, and you only have to satisfy the differential. So there's that aspect of do we go through a reconstituted to create a true load number as opposed to a sales number?
What do others think of that comments? And then we'll get to you, Chase, but I just want to play this one out first. Senator Bray.
Well, so this is reminding me of another conversation about defining obligations based on purchases, portfolio purchases as opposed to sales, so that you accommodate line losses. There were a number of comments along that side. So if you're going, true load is like going the other way. Like now you're deducting out what's generated behind the meter, and then it would seem like, so I don't know if we want to go there.
It's like that's too far in the weeds.
And also then you'd have to start qualifying what was causing your true load to be smaller. So sales was the comment I heard about. Like, let's move from sales to portfolio purchases.
Other comments or thoughts or clarifications sparked by Brian's comment, and then I'll go back to the queue online. Chase, go ahead.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Mostly, I wanted to respond to William's comment or accept his sort of invitation to have like a discussion and explanation of how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions with new renewables. But before I jump into that, let me just say that I agree with what Ben said about unbundling RECs and generally how RECs are used in the current marketplace, and just accepting that as where policy is today in the United States, in our region, and how the concept of getting enough new renewables online is really helpful, and then hopefully not having to dig too deeply into the weeds about unbundling RECs for certain types of generation. But now circling back to the question of why do we need new renewables? In the context of these conversations, I think we've already said this before, in particular to reforming Vermont's renewable energy standard. But I think it's worth reiterating just to make sure that we're all on the same page and there aren't misunderstandings. Nobody is saying that existing renewables will cease to count. So just to make that abundantly clear, existing renewables will remain part of the equation. And as far as I can tell, there is consensus on the idea that different utilities will likely see different plans. And so we're not talking about a one-size-fits-all policy approach here. So hopefully within that sort of base setting framework, there's room to then figure out some of these other questions. I think it provides a pretty good basis to do so.
Is that a base setting that when that lands on your ears, are you nodding?
So I have to clarify what that means. Are you talking about then the status quo in terms of unbundled recs? Or are you talking about going to the 2010 number and not including Hydro-Quebec?
Oh, geez. Well, I think on those details, those are probably best addressed when the conversation really moves to that part of the sort of policy contemplation. I think right now what I'm saying is that when I say we, I'm speaking for CLF, but I believe on behalf of a broad coalition of other environmental groups who have been talking about reforming the res for a couple of years, we're not interested in saying you can't use renewables that exist now. There is value in using those renewables because they do constitute the status quo. Right now, we have reduced emissions by bringing those renewables online, and we should continue to garner the greenhouse gas reductions that we've achieved from them. We should maintain. We shouldn't give up any ground that we've made. We should keep that, but we need to build upon it. And so, when I say that existing renewables have a place, that's what I mean. We should continue. They should continue to play into our res. There should be a part of our res that continues to count the existing renewables.
There's a clarification, I think. Chase?
Okay.
Well, maybe it's clarification. It's just a question for the 100% renewable utilities right now. What do you do with load growth? Do you just presume that has to be renewable?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it's hard for me to imagine a scenario in which we would not cover load growth through renewables. Technically, I guess it's possible. Are
you obligated to or no?
Oh, we're obligated to if we want to not take standard offer power. So with the 100% renewable utilities have an exemption from the obligation to take their share of the standard offer power, which is expensive. So the consequences financially of doing that would be significant. More importantly, my members want to have 100% renewable utility, and members make up our board and direct our policy. So we're not going to go away from that.
And it's you and BED and who's
Swan.
Swanton. And I'll confirm, Representative Sibilia, we're the same way.
Okay.
Swanton has the same view.
So Chase, I think we interrupted.
That was perhaps one of the most useful interruptions that I've ever been a part of. So I appreciated that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
What I was going to say, and I won't belabor this point, I said basically the same thing at our last meeting, sort of at the beginning of the meeting. But the idea basically of why we need new renewables is a pretty straightforward one. It's, I think, a really fact-based type of analysis. It's that if load increases, we're going to need more that means we need more electricity. We anticipate that's going to happen because we're going to have more EVs, more heat pumps coming online, more electric home appliances. Not only do we anticipate it, but we really hope that happens, because those are the steps that need to be taken if we're actually getting serious about slashing fossil fuel use and addressing the climate crisis. It's just what has to happen. And in fact, the Vermont Climate Council has projected it, and through analysis done by Cadmus, they're projecting load growth for the electricity sector. If we just use existing renewables, if we just rely on the status quo, that new load is going to be basically in the larger system that we're part of. It's going to be met by something. And if not new renewables, then what? And in the larger system that we're part of, that would likely mean that we're pulling from the grid mix, which uses fossil fuels. And so in that way, we just need to bring new renewables online. Vermont does not exist in a vacuum. We exist as part of a region, so New England, and so therefore we just need to bring new renewables online as load grows. Otherwise, we see greenhouse gas emissions actually go up.
Sorry, go ahead.
Melissa, do you want to finish that?
Yeah, just a point of clarification. The res is a percentage of load-based system. So as load growth grows, so does your obligation under the res.
Okay.
I presume that would still be true if we set the res at 100% in 2030. So now, if we're all good with unbundled recs, that might be done through purchase of recs. But the res is not a per kilowatt hour or usage basis. It's a percentage of load.
I was going to make a very similar comment to Lewis, is that as you know, as Vermont sets a standard at 100%, as the other New England states move to 100%, you're going to put price pressure on the existing renewables. That's going to drive new renewables in that anyway, and that would happen in the marketplace. So I think putting the 100% stake in the ground will drive that anyways.
Ken, thanks for your patience.
No, thanks. I had a similar comment. I'm just trying to work the logic in my mind, right? So we seem to have growing consensus around 100% clean or 100% renewable. So we all are going to have to buy additional renewable to move from the 75% to the 100%. I think there's general consensus that if our electrification efforts work, we're going to see loads increase. And I've heard numbers in the 2 to 2.5 times the load. And I've heard several times that Vermont's behind the other states in our renewable efforts. So it's not like other states are going all fossil fuel and building new fossil plants that we're going to tap into. They're building renewables too. So I struggle to understand how we can say moving to 100% renewable and forcing the utilities to meet that load growth with renewable resources isn't going to result in us having to build new renewables. What I see is similar to what William said earlier. As we break down into tiers and say, well, only certain resources qualify here and there, we're actually picking winners and losers. And we're diverting money to certain technologies and certain people. And that makes it more expensive and harder to manage and significantly more overhead for the utilities to meet our compliance and the regulators to make sure we're meeting our compliance. So if our goal is to be 100% clean and deal with climate issues, I still struggle to understand why we need to break down into multiple tiers and pick solar versus wind versus hydro. I think naturally the impetus and the incentives are going to drive us in the direction of building those new resources.
Ben, go ahead. Response to that, I think.
I think William was before me.
If you have a response to Ken, you're welcome. If
Okay.
Comment, and we'll go to William first.
It is a response to Ken, and sort of a further expansion on what themes that Chase was bringing forward. So, I mean, I guess just directly to address the question of like, are we picking winners and losers? Is that a good thing? Like, I want new renewables to win. Like, we don't solve the climate crisis without building a lot more renewable energy than we already have. Like, full stop. They need to win, or not cutting carbon pollution sufficient to meet the moment, right? Like, that's just the truth. From a, like, what if we just get all, existing renewables for load growth? Like, wouldn't that also be good? I can see the argument that on the margins over enough time, if all of the other states also went to 100%, which is not a given, they haven't all done that, although certainly some have, then yes, you would have to build more renewables, but we can't control what every other state does. What we can control is what's required of utilities in Vermont. That's why we're all here. And let me put it this way, existing renewables exist. They're already generating power. Someone somewhere is already using that power. So if we are using more electricity because of electrification and everything else, and only going to get some new additional existing renewable that someone else is already using, and we're pulling that onto our balance sheets and into our state, then that is renewable power that isn't being used by whoever is using it right now, right? So if we want to actually cut carbon pollution for new load in particular, new renewables have to get built. And the only way to ensure that is to put that in the renewable energy standard. That's what a renewable energy standard is. It's a policy that requires certain types of renewables to be procured and in the case of new renewables, built. I guess the last thing I would say is, and TJ went through past it pretty quickly, but in the DPS's modeling, it's very clear that new renewables are driving regional carbon reductions and existing renewables are not. Maybe that's something that we can expand in a future meeting. Oh, I'm sorry, TJ is still here. So maybe that's something you can speak to. But that was illuminating for me and is something that a lot of us have been saying for a while. Making things look really good from a carbon standpoint in Vermont is not sufficient. We actually have to reduce regional and the global carbon emissions, and new renewables is how you do that. So it's not all of it. We're not saying 100% new renewables. Again, no one in this room has suggested that, but more than the 10% we have right now.
Was there a quick point of information that would be helpful there?
Sure.
There's a couple people waiting on comments, but if there's something.
Yeah, I think what Ben said is right. So the carbon emissions benefits in our model is calculated by new renewables replacing what is on the margin in ISO New England. The clarification I want to make too is I just want to make sure folks are thinking about that. There's what is physically happening, and then what our policy drives. Our Global Warming Solutions Act is predicated on greenhouse gas inventory, which tracks emissions from the electric sector on an annual basis based on the retirement of RECs, right? So that policy is not driving new renewables in this context because it is just saying a REC from an existing resource or nuclear is equal to a new renewable in progress towards our GHG requirements in the GWSA. But what physically is happening in the model in societal benefit is avoiding marginal emissions with new renewables not existing because they are already existing.
So these are questions related right to.
It's
Yeah.
real quick. The important point to me in this new renewable conversation is what is our marginal source of energy in this region, right? Marginal means what comes on when we don't have enough, right? That is most of the time it's natural gas. So when Ben is talking about or TJ is talking about the value of the greenhouse gas emissions reductions of new renewables, that new renewable is literally pushing out at some point the need for more natural gas, right? That's the value of new renewables. That's why we keep talking about new renewables. An existing source, as Ben said, does not push natural gas off the marginal use, because if we take it, someone else isn't going to get it and they have to go somewhere else. And that's probably at some point natural gas, right? It could be oil in the winter if we have natural gas shortage. I just want to talk, that's why new renewables are so important. Is that clear as mud? Kind of. Basically, new renewables at some point displace natural gas use in New England. That's why we need it. That's how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions in our area.
I just have a data point precisely on what is coming. There's one data point.
What is it?
ISO New England has an interconnection queue. What's coming? What wants to be built and be in the system, right? This is, not all of it gets built, but clearly, at least proportionally, it is absolutely over time has demonstrated this is accurate. This is the stuff that's going to be built. So back in the day, June of 2017, there's 48% natural gas, 44% wind, 6% solar, and 2% other stuff. Cats and dogs. Right now, in the queue right now, 44%, which I haven't heard yet, is storage, battery storage projects, 44%. The other 44% is wind, offshore and onshore wind. Solar is an additional 11%, and there is 1% of natural gas, which you've heard NERC, which you've heard ISO New England talk about. This is what we need if we're going to be able to not have real expensive stuff. We have to keep the lights on. So where is the New England grid going? That's where it's going.
What's the time frame? Sorry.
That's fine.
This is a Q snapshot as of September 2023. Now that comprises all the projects, and what's the time frame as they get built? It's a whole host of differentiation of different projects at different timelines.
Can I just very briefly?
Well, hold on for just a minute, Chase. Here's the challenge. So I know, William, you've been waiting for a little while, and there's some hum still around this piece. So I'm gathering those. I haven't forgotten about you, and then we'll come back.
Question about the queue.
How many people have questions just to Carrick's comment? Let's go there.
Okay,
Chase also. So let's go with the legislative team and then Chase will take the comment and Ken if it was just related.
I'm curious about the queue, Carrick. Like, so you said in 2017, it said this. Were those 2017 projects built or not built?
Generally speaking, they were.
Okay.
Some of the ones that fell off, honestly, were natural gas projects that fell off.
Okay.
Because of the evolving policies that happened in New England.
Okay. Because I'm just wondering how reliable the queue is as a predictor of what's going to happen in the future.
I apologize. I didn't express that as articulately as I should. I don't know the exact percentage. Like, here's how many we know on a general time frame. It has a 88% hit rate or something like that. I don't know exactly what that is. But when you're getting a sense of here's what's coming, because you got to pay to get in the queue, so you have to be pretty serious. And then you lose it, especially with new FERC rules, you lose that slot in the queue if you don't keep going in. In fact, they're going to raise the bar of what it takes to stay in the queue. So these are serious projects. The exact hit rate, I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Sibilia.
Yeah, so I'd love to understand more about that data.
Sure.
I think what you told us is the percentages you gave us was of what is in the queue to be built. And so I would like to understand how that relates to, if that's built, what does the system mix become? That's one. And then also just when we think about, I just want to remind everyone of this, who's a little bit more articulate, when we're thinking about cleaning up the New England mix, that always, it hits me in a bad place, okay? Because I really want that translated to Vermonters. So I understand that we're connected and that there are cause and effect, but really help me understand if you can just take that next layer to how that relates to Vermonters, ratepayers, people who need power. So.
Can I piggyback on that question?
Well, do you want to, is there a way to respond to that in a moment?
One response I would make. At a date certain, and I don't remember what that date certain is, ISO New England already contemplates that they're going to have a fundamentally shifted system. They see what's happening. They know what's going on. And so this is a reflection of ultimately the kind of system we're going to have. Large-scale transmission will do some whole-scale decarbonization, ultimately serve as a backup to all this stuff that's going on back. And that's why bidirectionality. That's why we have to get smarter about data. That's the only response.
Okay, so a reminder of the queue. It's Senator Bray, then Brian, Chase, and then Ken, and William.
Well, to piggyback on Representative Sebelia's question, I hear, concerns, legitimate concerns about the grid mix, but what I'm always wondering about is like how relevant grid mix is to what's happening at the utility level. Individual utilities have their own contracts. The grid mix could be X, but Vermont could have a very different profile. So, and then it gets into the question, well, I don't actually want to worry about what the grid mix is. I want to focus on what Vermont's mix is. Now, if the grid mix were renewables were scarce, then it would, it seemed like we would drive stuff by going after scarce resources. But I feel like we go back and forth between what's actually happening in Vermont and talking about what the grid mix is. And sometimes I think it's a little unhelpful.
Right.
My question for Carrick, the aspect of storage, you said 44% storage.
Yeah.
Okay. Where's the electricity going to come from that's going to serve that 44% of storage? Because storage itself does not create electricity. So these are stationary devices that are only going to be intermittently fed by something. Where is that something going to come from?
You delivered that in the form of a Perry Mason gotcha.
I know.
Thank you. I'm fully familiar what storage is and what it is not. And I think the people around this table are, so thank you for that helpful reminder. In terms of the electricity, first of all, you have to ask some of these individual battery storage owners, right? And maybe it's co-located with a specific generation source, which is why there's other wind and solars in there. That's one. Two, with the prospect of offshore wind, given the in topology where maybe this first tranche of wind projects are going to be, when they're generating, they're probably all going to be generated at the same time. And how do they better utilize that energy that's coming off if you're only a couple nautical miles away and the prevailing winds are kind of in the same wind regime? That's one. And then finally, the other potential sources, I'm not sure, you have to ask them, but I get you. In terms of indicative though, is there new gas plants being proposed? No. Is there a new gas pipeline being proposed? No, is there not. Is there much more support for Hydro-Quebec among the region that's kind of following Vermont? Yes, there is. So that's the way I would respond.
I have a really quick adder, because on the REV conference, I went to the hydropower presentation, and I would guess Northfield's a big piece of that.
The pump storage.
Yeah, the pump storage, because it was.
Great point.
Yeah, I mean, that was what I got from there.
Chase, then Ken.
Thanks. I just wanted to note that the queue in ISO New England of more renewables, more storage coming online is not exclusive to this region. We're seeing similar trends across the country and indeed across the globe. And in large part, that is a reflection of the fact that the cost of generating electricity with wind and solar has fallen significantly, such that it can be developed in a way that outcompetes fossil fuels now. So the economics have changed in addition to the climate crisis change. So I just wanted to lift that up because this is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in the free market in which we all live. Renewables have just become more affordable. And that's one of the things we're seeing driving this. I also wanted to, and I'm basing that on EIA numbers. I see you shaking your head, and other analyses that we have reviewed pretty closely. So, and I also just wanted to note though, that in ISO New England, there has been for a long time a policy bottleneck called MOPR, the minimum offer price rule, which has essentially taken, the result has been that all of the renewables that queue up and try to get on the grid get choked out by the fossil fuel industry, which has been, and really the natural gas industry, which has been able to capture a share of generation that they really shouldn't have from an economic perspective. And I just want to note that the queue itself isn't indicative necessarily of what actually happens in the region. The queue is aspirational, what people want to get done. And then the regulators at ISO New England, much like regulators in Vermont, review the applications, and some of the projects get done and some of the projects don't get done. And so we can't accept a one-to-one correlation between what's in the queue and what gets built. And I guess I would just note then that this is the last thing I'll say on this point, is that right now, the mix in New England is about 40% natural gas. And the facilities that exist now will exist, that exist today will exist tomorrow. Until those existing fossil fuel facilities become retired, when we take them offline, they can still be creating electricity by burning fossil fuels. And so I just really want to say that we cannot accept as inevitable that what's happening in ISO New England means the problem is solved. That has not been the case until now, and the analyses so far indicate that that's just not going to be the case tomorrow. We need to bring on enough new renewables to displace existing fossil fuel. We need to decommission existing fossil fuel electricity generation sources. So I said, I think at least 3 things there, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in the last few comments. I will say, as a power supply practitioner who's in the market pretty much every day, I haven't spoken to a fossil fuel generator in at least 6 years. The only generators that we contemplate contracting with are renewable resources, and we're getting a lot of interest from nuclear, which frankly we're holding at bay until we figure out which direction the legislature is going to take this conversation. So in some ways, you're stopping us from contracting for resources because we don't know the rules of the road. I do want to thank Chase for making one of my points, which is there's a tendency in Vermont and in the legislature for command and control. Like, we have to tell people what to do or they're not going to do it. And I think we do a disservice to the ratepayers when we dive into the weeds and try to get very specific in how we define things versus relying to some degree on the market. And as Chase said, the prices on renewables are coming down. It's comparable. It's actually an economic decision now to do the right thing. It's not a regulatory requirement. It's very hard to get a fossil fuel generator through the ISO queue. I agree that the queue chokes things out, but the only thing that's being proposed really at this point is renewables. So Vermont can say we want to build 1,000 megawatts of renewables, and if ISO New England's not going to let it through the queue, it's not going to get built anyway, regardless of what our res says. So we're mixing a lot of practical deployment issues with policy setting. And I come back to, when you combine what's being proposed, the Q Carrick put out, the economic situation that renewables are under now, and the fact that all the Vermont utilities have pretty much said we're going to go to 100% renewable regardless, I question how much command and control we really need versus simplifying this conversation and getting to the meat of what are we trying to accomplish. And if it's climate change mitigation and greenhouse gas reduction, then let's talk about the resources that qualify for that and let the utilities figure it out.
Thanks, Ken.
Can I ask Ken a quick?
Yeah.
Ken, so I appreciate your remark, and I just want to check in on the current RES. Is the current RES a command and control piece of legislation, or is it creating a target and utilities choose their own path?
So I would say tier 1 is much more choose your own path. Their tier 2 is very specific, right? It has to be less than 5 megawatts, connected to the distribution system, built after 2015. If I'm GMP, that's probably not onerous because I have a huge territory. If I'm Orleans or Hyde Park in Brian's case, that's a pretty high bar. And it drives you to make certain decisions and work with certain people. And I don't know that it brings any additional benefit to the climate conversation. That's my take on it is, you could just as easily meet our climate goals by saying tier 1's 100% renewable and here's the generation that qualifies, and let the utilities make the economic decision they need to get there.
Thanks. I just wanted to understand what you were saying moving forward compared to what we have.
William, thanks for your patience.
Yeah, the conversation is.
It's gone a lot of ways, but it's coming back.
Yeah, so I appreciate the follow-up. I do want to agree with and appreciate in particular Ken's comments, both rounds, his initial comments and then the most recent one. And hopefully want to address either sort of clarify or kind of get into some of the points that Chase and Ben brought up. There might be some either misunderstandings or fallacies. I think there's sometimes a reaction if we say we don't think there should be a mandate for new renewables, that sometimes maybe some people hear that as like there shouldn't be new renewables. And that's certainly not what I'm talking about. It's mandating a specific amount, which is problematic. And I simply don't accept the premise. I would dispute that if we don't mandate new renewables, they won't be built. And even more so, if we don't build new renewables, we're going to meet new load through fossil fuels or whatnot. As long as you have the overarching requirement, whether it's 100% renewable or 100% clean, regardless of what that is, to the extent that power becomes available from existing renewable or clean resources. That might be through contract churn, maybe increased capacity plans, because increasing capacity can get into it, whether that's new or not new. If that's available and it's meeting sort of the price and reliability priorities, then the utility should contract with that. And it is legitimately meeting the needs of ensuring that our electric portfolio is not contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. Now, to the extent that there's not sufficient power available from existing renewables or existing clean, then kind of similar to what Ken I think was saying, that the market demand will drive new renewables or new clean as required, because you're still going to have the overarching requirement. You're not, if we have this, whether it's clean or renewable, if you have 100% mandate, then that's going to have to be met through that kind of power. If there's not existing, then there'll have to be new. You're not going to have the option unless, just putting some, pressure relief, weedy stuff about going to fossil fuel to meet that need. Again, if Vermont is doing its part and we're meeting our portfolio priorities, then it shouldn't matter whether it's new or not. There'll be a mix of new, and it might not even just be availability and price. It could be strategic, distributed generation that drives it too. It should be what it naturally fits. And I also don't. There's two problems with if there's an assumption that if Vermont doesn't do it through new, then that's going to shift, or they'll deny renewable power to other people in New England, and then the other folks in New England will go to more fossil fuel. Given the portfolios that exist and how trends are moving in those states, just like here, I just don't think that that's a very credible assertion that that Vermont is going to crowd out renewable contracts in other states, both because of the mandates that are going to be in other states, and also, let's be honest about how big we are and how much of an impact we can really have on the rest of the New England market. So I think let's have kind of like what Ken was saying. Let's have our overarching goal. Hopefully, can resolve the clean versus renewable. But if it's 100%, whatever time frame it is, great, and let's meet that with as much flexibility to do it and actually meet those climate goals at the most affordable and reliable way.
William, thank you. So a time check, we're at 11. In a couple of moments, we'll take a break. To the legislative team, you have questions right now that you're sitting on.
How many?
It's a lot. Well, relative to this conversation.
I just have thoughts on next conversation. Maybe we should have.
Yeah, me too. I guess my question is there a place we can arrive at today?
It seems like there's an interest to me that in saying, yep, we agree to 100%, then we keep going to those detailed questions, but we can move on to one. And I phrase it a little differently. Lewis phrased it earlier really well. I put you on the spot to do that again in terms of crux of the question of kind of like how much. But another way, I also just keep thinking like maybe another angle on this conversation is what's renewable? Because we haven't really gotten there yet. And I kind of keep going back to the basic question of that seems like the center for me is how do we get to agreement on, okay, we can move to 100% renewable or clean. We still need to figure that out. But if we agree to it, what does renewable mean? And that's, different people have a lot of different perspectives.
I open it right up.
I think it will.
Sort of a sideline to that question. Sometimes we hear concerns about Vermont's rules because of what we allow as renewable. But my understanding, and I need to learn more, maybe I should do this offline, is that Massachusetts also has a clean energy standard. And so the state is, its path is directed by both, not just by their Yes. And so I'm trying to figure out if we're only operating with one, do we look, I'd just like to learn from the Massachusetts example, as opposed to saying their RPS is different from ours, and that's the end of the story. It's like, well, but their RPS is not the only thing directing what happens in Massachusetts. And so the two of us control. So I want to compare what we're looking at, like a complete evaluation of the Massachusetts model, not just a fragment of it. It feels like it's an apples and oranges discussion. I'll take that one offline. Feels a little abstruse.
So, I think we've may reached consensus on another important point, which is that acknowledging that the rec system exists and is going to continue to exist and be part of this, and how utilities meet their obligation. So that's, in my mind, that's big. So, we have general consensus that we're going to go to 100% renewable at some date in the faster than we would under the res as it stands now, and that recs bundled and unbundled are real in the sense that they're how we account for the renewable attributes of that power. So that's a lot.
Although I'm not sure I've still heard the answer from the environmental groups on I've heard you say repeatedly you accept that recs need to be part of it and bundled and unbundled, but not the Hydro-Quebec, the old large-scale hydro.
Ben said that. He said, it really will depend on the level of new renewables, the ability to continue to accept those is contingent on this.
So that's a piece we need to talk through. We haven't really fully agreed to that.
Well,
we don't have consensus on it.
Mia?
I found it really helpful at the beginning when you had sort of a list of the questions. I think it was just sort of prefacing the discussion, but I've found that these discussions are really valuable, but they tend to be circular. And I think it would be really helpful to, even if it's something that has to be decided as a group, come up with a list of the questions and figure out which things are contingent on other things, like dates seem to be contingent on other decisions, things like that. I think if we could attack this in a sort of point by point, I know everything bleeds together, but that sort of approach might help us move forward.
In which case I would add the question, what is affordable? Because people really like that. We need to agree, like, what's our goal? I won't go any further, but I could say a lot on that.
At the risk of stating the obvious, I'd say affordable, what we want to do is achieve the goal that we have for the res at the lowest price in order to incentivize beneficial electrification. So
it might be different than what we're paying today, that we might see as expensive or not expensive.
It will be.
It could be more, could be less. I don't know.
I think it's very unlikely to be less, but possibly.
The status quo has its own costs, and we're all seeing those pressures too, and our existing contracts and other things as well. So I don't think it's without cost on that current path either.
Yep.
So some of the tensions that you've surfaced in this conversation have been running through all of your conversations that you've had to date. They showed up on those rough lists that we made in the first couple of meetings, around how policy reinforces new renewables and provides as much flexibility as possible for how to meet requirements. So I think, to try to sum up, you covered a lot of territory, and to say that it's secure in terms of a shared understanding might be a little premature, but you have hooked two things around accepting that RECs or unbundled RECs are part of the system, with the understanding that you're shifting to a frame of making sure it doesn't hinder new renewables. What's the right level of new renewables in Vermont? So if that question is still vibrant and alive, then yes, the unbundled RECs fades a bit because it's not the same mechanism with which to talk about the right level of new renewables in Vermont. That's a shift that I think a collective group of you have started to make. And you've talked a bit about, as loads increase, how is this policy going to look to meet those new loads? What's the right level of new renewables in Vermont? that might also be part of where the clean or renewable standard definitely comes in. You haven't spent a lot of time talking about whether this is a clean standard or a renewable standard. It's come up, but you've not discussed it.
If I might note,
Yeah.
and I pledge not to say anything in this meeting, so sorry about that. If I might note, one thing we have not talked about much in this group and that we need to before the end of this process is net metering. It's kind of a side issue to the res, but it's important, and I think it was intended to be part of this discussion, and it is something we need to cover at some point. So I'll just put that down as a marker and leave it at that.
There's a lot of elements to this conversation or overall in the charge for this group to cover, including around affordability and the various impacts of all these different changes you might consider. Christopher, I noticed that your hand went up and then went down. We are due for a break so we can come back for public comment. I think, legislative team, we have a little bit of time built in at the end of this meeting after public comment to figure out where this conversation goes next. So let's use that time. In the meantime, take a break, come back at 11:15 is only 6 minutes away. So please